evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for today's panel and for hopping on a Friday night. My name is Diana Tsuchida, and I'm the creator of Tasaku, which is an oral history project dedicated to sharing the experiences and stories of Japanese Americans who lived through World War II and the incarceration. I'm honored to be hosting tonight's panel, A Place to Japanese Americans in Keetley during World War II. And I'm excited to once again be part of the second Tadaima and to share this amazing story with all of you. So I want to share first a little bit of what our run of show is going to be and what to expect in tonight's panel. I'm going to first introduce our three panelists who are with us on screen right now. And then I'm going to give a little historical context to Keetley and sort of what led this decision to find another place to live. And then we're going to have each panelist bring in and share their own personal family stories and the decisions that their parents made to relocate before the camps were mandated for all Japanese Americans. So please feel free to send in your questions on the side of the chat, and we'll try to answer those throughout the panel and get to them. So first, I'm going to invite everyone to, I think we lost one panelist, Howard. Oh, he's back. So I'm going to introduce our wonderful panel. The first is Mary Wada Roath. Mary is the daughter of Fred Wada, who was essentially the architect of this relocation to Keetley, Utah. Our next panelist is Howard Yamamoto, who was actually a child at the time that his parents decided to go to Keetley and live. So he was young, but he does remember quite a bit. And so it's an honor to have Howard with us. And then we have Emiko Katsumoto, who is part of the very prominent and large Endo family from the Bay Area. The Endos also made plans to join the Wada relocation plan and go to Keetley to farm. So we will talk to everybody separately, and I'm going to first invite Mary to stay on screen as we go through a little bit of historical context for what exactly led up to this. So as most of you probably know, you're watching and you either have family who experienced the incarceration or you may know about it, but in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, there was much racial hysteria, anti-Japanese discrimination and prejudice, which was running rampant, especially on the West Coast, where the majority of Japanese and Japanese Americans were living. So within the signing of Executive Order 9066 in February of 1942, that basically put into motion the military mandate to move all Japanese out of the West Coast. And so 2 military zones were created. Basically, they eventually included all of California and then the western half of Oregon and Washington. You know, and many of you maybe out there that had family that were incarcerated, you know, this was not only a egregious violation of civil liberties, but also, you know, a land grab in order to really cut into the economic viability and contribution of the Japanese who were living all along the West Coast, who farmed, who were fishing, who contributed to different labor sectors and were entrepreneurs. And of course, that resulted in the uprooting of more than 100,000 people from their homes. And so after the signing of Executive Order 9066, the military designated these zones, but gave people about 2 weeks, maybe 2 to 3 weeks, a very short amount of time to voluntarily relocate. So if you could get out of their designated zones, you could effectively avoid being incarcerated. In fact, that was their first intention, was just to make everybody voluntarily go, but that was logistically impossible. So of course, then the order to build the camps, the 10 WRA camps, and incarcerate the Japanese Americans was put into effect. And so, but if you had the opportunity or the resources to decide to leave, then you could do that. And I believe that that cutoff point was about the end of March, so March 1942. So just to give you some numbers and why this is a rare occasion to hear from 3 descendants of people whose families were able to make such a drastic move out of these zones. Just about 5,000 people made the move out of the West Coast. And so that's just a drop in the bucket of the number of people who are actually living in these areas and that were actually in camp. And so just about 5,000 people were able to leave and found opportunities elsewhere in Utah, Colorado. They could have gone a little bit further, but basically were able to find somewhere else to go. So before we go to Mary and begin hearing her story, I first also want to share where Keetley is, because this is where we're going to be located during this talk. So Keetley, Utah is now underwater at the Jordanelle Reservoir in just north of Heber City in Utah. Now, the most major city that's closest to it is Park City, Utah. So it's about 20 minutes away from Jordanelle. But that's where Keetley was. It was an old mining town. And this is where Mr. Wada was able to locate a new place to go. So Mary, thank you again for being here and being willing to share your story. I want to first talk about your parents, because they really are the foundation for this. And so can you talk about how they met, who they were, and how they basically ended up in the Bay Area to live their lives?
Sure. Thank you, Diana, for first inviting me to this panel. I do want to say that my parents rarely talked about Keetley. And so a lot of the material I had to research myself through interviews my father had in 1977 and some Japanese magazines that were translated into English that was written about my father, and also some material that was written in the 40s. And Tom Endo also kindly sent some materials for me. So I had a lot of researching to do. But about my parents, they met in Monterey. My mother was living in Monterey with her father. My grandfather had a cousin who had a abalone canning company. And so my mother had just come from Japan. However, my mother was born in Utah. And when she was 10, she had gone back to Japan with my grandmother and my mother's siblings, because the harsh winters were too hard on my mother. So my grandfather would stay on the farm in Utah, and he'd go back and forth to Japan and the U.S. And every time he would come to Japan, all the children would say, "Who is that stranger? Who is that man? When is he going to go back?" So it was an interesting lifestyle that they had. But my father was 25. He was from Wakayama, and he was had his own business, and he was looking for a bride. And in San Jose, my aunt, my father's younger sister, the Yamadas were living in San Jose. And Mrs. Yamada, my aunt, said that there was a young woman who came from Wakayama and that we should go and meet her. And so this is what they did. And this is how my parents met. And I did once ask my mother what she thought of my father and what was the first impression. And she said, well, she said, he wore a hat, and the way he tipped his hat, she said she thought was very appealing. And of course, my grandfather said, well, if you marry him, she says, you will never be poor. So they were married in November of 1933, and that's how they met.
Oh, wonderful. It was as simple as that, huh?
Yeah. When I'm sure when my grandfather said, "You'll never be poor," that was a clincher.
That was too, yes. But they, so they met early on. They were both Kibe Nisei.
That's right.
And I want to talk about your dad because a lot has been written about him, and there's quite a bit of material out there about who Fred Wada was. So I want to ask you about his personality, and was he a natural leader? Were there traits that you think he had that make sense in terms of him making this decision to, make a drastic change and move in the light of the war?
Yes. Well, I don't think that people are born leaders. I think that one becomes self-sufficient and dependent on himself. And my father was a person who was like that. He was very self-sufficient, very independent. But he was born in Bellingham, Washington in 1907. When he was 5 years old, his mother died of childbirth. And so the children were raised in Wakayama, Japan. My father was raised by his paternal grandparents, and the three daughters were raised by the mother's side of the family. So now he was pretty much alone most of the time, and I don't think that the grandparents were too excited about having to raise a 5-year-old boy. When he started school, his grandfather taught him how to make his own sandals out of rice straw because he would have to walk 3 miles back and forth to school, and his sandals would always fall apart. He grew up mainly eating okayu or gruel and potatoes and dried fish. He says what he would take for lunches would be onigiri with umeboshi inside, and that was his lunch. And his chore after coming home was to go up this steep hill to get osake for his grandfather every day. That was his chore. He grew up in a fishing village, and his grandparents were elderly, so they were more responsible for the nets, large nets, small nets, always keeping them ready for fish. And I think what he examined there really had a strong influence on his life. He saw the villagers working together. And the fishermen out at sea, they would have flags, and there'd be a man up on the hillside. He'd have a red flag and a white flag. If there was a big school of fish, they'd raise the red flag. If it was a small school, it'd be the white flag. And so the villagers were always waiting, knowing what to do, what to prepare for. And my father saw this interaction. They would bring the fish in, and then they would separate the fish amongst the villagers. They would keep the largest fish and the best, rarest fish for market. And this system, I think, was something that my father had followed throughout his life, even in business. Mm-hmm. And let me see.
I'll go to this photo too, if the one of your father at his early produce stand.
Right. Well, this is, when he was 12, he was sent back to the US because his father had remarried, and he had 4 children by then. So now my father was the eldest of 8 children, and he had a lot of his responsibility. He had to go to work right away. He was sent to a tomato farm picking tomatoes. He was a schoolboy, and when he was 16 and he was driving, he would drive a milk truck through Terminal Island, and he would have little kids on the truck as well, and the little kids would go out and deliver the milk to the houses. That was his system. And then later, when he was 18, he had this little market, and that was his very first fruit stand, his first produce stand. Mm-hmm. So now we go when he's older and he's married and he's got his wife and 2 children. He had a very successful market, and he fought the Teamsters Union because they wanted to unionize his market, and he refused, and even fought and sued the Teamsters Union several times, it said. So he was never intimidated really by the Caucasian, and I think that was a real strong point for him.
Mm-hmm. And so why? I mean, and I love this photo because the produce is so just so beautifully organized, and it's such a great photo of the success that he found.
Right. Yes, and it was a
Um,
variety of people, a mixture of
mhm,
people, and that was, quite
right.
rare because it wasn't just the Japanese that he hired.
Right,
Mhm.
exactly. And so when the war broke out and it was imminent that, they were going to have to move or do something about um, moving, and basically he made this decision. Why did he choose Utah, and how did he decide to go and settle there?
Right. I should say before then that my parents were in Los Angeles, visiting family and friends from Oakland,
Mhm.
and they had gone to see a movie, a Japanese movie. When they came out of the movie theater, there was just a group of people who were jeering and yelling and throwing things at them. And, my mother often uses the word osoroshi. Osoroshi meaning really frightening. She had never seen a group of angry people before. And I think from then on, they realized that life would never be the same for them. And my father knew that he had to go back and clean up his market and try to, get away. So he had heard the following day that many of the Japanese were being picked up by the FBI. So they waited a few days, and then they went back to Oakland.
Mhm.
And then when you went back to Oakland, fortunately he wasn't picked up, but he didn't want to be interned, and he read in the newspaper that people had these choices that if you moved out of the military zone, you could avoid incarceration. And so, without hesitation, my father knew what he was going to do. He was going to move out of the state. And I guess the reason for choosing Utah has a lot to do with what he had read in the newspaper.
See.
So, was your question about Keatley? Not yet.
It was, well, we can transition to Keatley. So he
Uh-huh.
maybe got wind, and so for instance, he was reading a Japanese newspaper,
Right.
and sort of learned that if you went far enough east.
Well, this was really, I think, in the Oakland newspaper saying that if you didn't want to go into camp, move out of the military zone
Mhm.
and to go farther east. And so this is what he decided to do. Um,
I
Let me
see.
see. I think when they returned to Oakland, people stopped coming to the market, of course. And so he decided that they were going to move out.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
this so I think this Keatley comes a little bit after. I was going to explain that
Mhm.
my mother had uh, was born in Keatley in 1913. So was born in Utah,
Mhm.
Riverside, Utah. So she knew what Utah and the Mormons were like. They were very kind people.
Mhm.
But she, grew up in Riverside. She went to school in a horse-drawn covered wagon. She churned butter and with her mother, and they sold the sweet butter to the local market. She talked often about being rolled over by a big Model T Ford because the Ford car was so high and she was so tiny, it just rolled right over her. And her memory of that that terror wasn't that car. It was more just not knowing, the unexpected. But she was very comfortable there. She remembers a kind lady coming to help her get up from under the car and gave her some chocolate. She had never eaten chocolate before, and that was her first
Oh, wow.
time that she had eaten chocolate. So that
Mhm.
was the story that we all heard very often.
And
So there were
so
yeah, so there were a lot of positive
Mhm.
feelings, and she shared them with my father, and so that's why my father said that he would go to Utah. But I think he was planning on going to Utah, just our immediate family. He would go there and he would start his own business again and start all
Mhm.
over. But then, he was close to his sisters. He was Nissan, so he had three sisters at that time, had families. So
Mhm.
considered them as, taking them with us.
Right. And so when they decided, he identified Keatley, were there any difficulties that they faced in relocating. And I'm going to transition to this, one of the old houses that was on that site. Did they face any discrimination when they finally went?
Yeah, after I have notes here, and it says after they arrived, after they heard about the shortage of the Utah labor, they needed laborers in Utah because many of them were joining the army and moving to get better jobs elsewhere. So my father had gone by himself to Salt Lake City, to the capital, and he talked with this man named Trevithick. He was head of the State Industrial and Welfare Department, and it was through him that he got in contact with George Fisher. And George Fisher at that time was the former chief Utah Land Utilization Agency. He lived in Keetley, which is only about 30, 40 miles away from Salt Lake City. And Mr. Trevithick told my father that he had some land available. And Keetley, as you said, was an abandoned mining town. But he had 1,500 hectares of land, 15 buildings, including a motel, and they were all run down and dilapidated, of course. But he would lease the land for $7,500. And when he was in Salt Lake City, he met with the Japanese community there who lived there, and they discouraged the Japanese from California from coming to Salt Lake City because they were already beginning to feel that strong anti-Asian sentiment, and they didn't want to fuel it more. And they felt that that would happen if the Californians came. And it was during that time, my father was eating in a Japanese restaurant owned by the Tsuyuki family. My father, by chance, met Frank Endo and Roy Tachiki, who were also looking for a place to self-relocate in Utah. And this was told to me by Tom Endo. And so they had lunch together, and they decided to go check out Keetley together. And I think this was the beginning of March when they decided to do this. And there was one stipulation that Mr. Fisher had requested of my father, and that was that my father had to convince the Utah citizens to accept the large Japanese colony into the state. My father didn't know, I don't know if any of the other men went with him, but he had to face 350 Utah community or citizens and try to get their permission to bring his colony of people with him. This meeting took place in a church in a town called Roosevelt. And there was a lot of animosity, of course. One man stood and said that his 2 sons were killed in Pearl Harbor and that he didn't want any Japs in the States. So, that was really a difficult situation. My father, with his limited education in English, but with sincerity, told him that he was bringing Japanese American citizens. They were loyal, good patriots, and that they were Christians, which is, I think most of them are Buddhists, but he told them that they were Christians and that they would be, not be dependent on the government. And he said if anyone did anything illegal, he would solely be responsible for that person or for the group. He also said in his own words, he says, if somebody does something wrong in this community, you could shoot me in front of a shooting squad or something like that. That was
Oh my gosh.
Well, he was desperate. He would do desperate things to convince them to accept the colony. And he promised that they would not become dependent on the government and that they would be self-sufficient and raise their own food, and they would raise food for the war efforts as well. So out of the 29 counties, only 2 were willing to accept the Japanese from California. So I think that was my father's strong point. He would take a situation like being in front of the 350 people, seize it, and just kind of make it his and try to convince people for what he believed in. So that was his strong point, I think.
Mhm. That's amazing. I mean, and that was a lot of pressure on him to go ahead before a community. Even if Mr. Fisher was supportive, but he said,
Well, he wasn't even at the meeting, according to my father. He didn't
"Oh,
go,
he
so he didn't even have his backing. But
oh,
I think my father really believed that the Mormons were good people,
mhm,
and like them, they had gone through the suffering that the Japanese were going through. So he knew that they would understand, and fortunately they did.
mhm. Wow. So yeah, so these photos here, are just this is obviously when the community started to was settled and the farming was beginning. And I want to ask about the food for victory
Mm,
strategy that your father kind of went in
right.
with the convincing. So how was that received, and do you feel like they helped make a positive impact on the local community with the produce that they were
Right.
able
I'm definitely sure that they did.
to?
When they went into Keetley, they transformed this land, which was all sagebrush, rocks, and boulders, and I think we just saw one tractor, but all the other, adults went in there by hand, took all these rocks and boulders out. My cousins, Alice Okayama, she was 12 at the time. She remembers taking the rocks out, and her cousin Fred Yamamoto did that too, and remembered the hardship that went through clearing this sagebrush land and making it as this picture shows, putting a dam in and with irrigation. So I don't know if that answers your question, but there was a
Mhm.
point where they were threatened. Someone had thrown some dynamite when they first arrived. And then my father received a letter. Of course, Mr. Fisher told Governor Ma of Utah at the time, he's told the governor, and the governor wrote a letter to my father saying, this is too risky. He says, I want you to pack up and take all your colony with you back to California.
Oh,
My
wow.
father, yeah, my father told my mother, but he just ignored the letter and they went on. And George
Wow.
Fisher deputized one of his grandsons to help, kind of watch the compound. And it turned
Mhm.
out years later that there was a young Indian man who worked at the mine nearby who threw that dynamite, and he became friends with some of the older high school kids that were in the Keetley group.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, so there were a lot of things that happened. And I think just their hard work and my father showed that they had this sign that the food was going to be shared.
Mhm.
They're going to be self-sustained. They're going to share it with the community,
Mhm.
and that they were good, decent, patriotic Americans.
Right. Which brings us to this photo, which I
Mhm.
love. Young men who had enlisted and then from
Right. Those are my uncles, and there were also other family members who joined the service as well. I know some of the Tsujimotos did.
oh
And
wow.
about being accepted in the community, I know my cousin who, Kim Yamada Kunitake, she still corresponds with one of her friends that she made in Heber City when they were in grammar school together.
Oh
And
wow.
some of these ladies, they worked as uh, domestics in Heber City and Salt Lake
Mhm.
City. One of my aunts, Martha Kawaki, worked for a doctor and his wife. And my cousin Dorothy says that for years even after the war, they sent my aunt gifts, because they were so grateful and thought highly of her. So they were very well accepted, I think, in that community.
Mhm.
Mhm. So these ladies, I should say, are netting for the Red Cross,
Mhm.
and maybe there's some family member who knows who these ladies are, but let's see, the one far on the left is Toyo Tsujimoto. She's the one who made that list of all the names of the people. Mie
Mhm.
Yamada, Masako Wada, my mother, Tomiko Iwamoto, Asako Endo, and the one on the right is Hiroko Tsujimoto. So there might be some family members who might recognize them in this photo.
Yeah, that would be wonderful if just so happened that there was someone related. And your final photo here, which is I think a wonderful one to end on, is one of children.
I think that's self-explanatory. And you know, they all had happy memories. When I asked my cousins or my aunts and uncles, they all had positive experiences and said nothing negative about their stay in Keetley. And I should say that Keetley was really a sort of a stepping point to other places. And some people stayed for 3 months. It took 3 months actually to get all that farming ready to start, planting seeds and everything. Like a lot of the Endo stayed for 3 months because the winters were so harsh and there wasn't enough food to sustain everybody. And my family stayed for 2 years because my sister would get asthma. And then my cousins, the Sujimotos, would stay there. They stayed there for the 4 years.
Oh, wow, the 4 years. Oh,
yeah, throughout the war.
That's amazing. Well, Mary, I think you set the stage for, really your father who designed this move. And this photo is I think a great transition to now speaking to Howard. And Mary, we'll see you soon. But for everyone out there, Howard is in this photo, and there he is. But Howard is in the back row, the third from right, with his hands over his overalls. So, Howard, that is proof that you were there.
Yeah, there I am, right? See, the back row, third kid from the right.
Third kid from the right.
Yep.
And
the one that's so sad.
No, you do look a little sad in there. Yes, you do look so happy to be taking a picture. But Howard, I want to start with asking about why Mr. Wada asked your family and your father to join him. What was their relationship, and why was he asked?
Well, basically, my father and Mr. Wada, they came from the same prefecture in Japan. And you know how they get together. Or are you from Hiroshima and all, how they all get together? But he became good friends with Mr. Wada. I like to call him Fred Wada.
Yes, Fred.
And in fact, he worked for Fred Wada for a while, driving a truck, the produce trucks. But essentially, we became a very close, pretty close family friends. I remember visiting him and such, and it was a pretty close relationship, the family.
Right.
But am I supposed to be on the panel now?
No, you're here. Yeah, you're here. And so that actually makes a lot of sense. So they were just friends from the Bay Area because your family was there as well. But when they decided to move, you and I have talked about this a bit, about the difficulty or the challenge of moving from California out to Utah, and particularly what your mother went through. Can you talk about, the concerns your mother had?
Okay, let me, before I get into that, let me give kind of a whole background, of the Japanese living in the big cities. First of all, many major cities in the Japanese lived in pretty close proximity to each other, and it's centered around the the Buddhist church and Japanese Christian church. In other words, there's comfort in numbers.
Right.
Okay.
Of course.
And I would say within these communities, 90% of the language in the community was spoken in Japanese. So it was a very close-knit pocket there. Not only that, if you wanted to break out of that pocket, it was extremely difficult to rent or purchase homes outside of the pocket because of racial barriers. And I think this practice still exists today. But when the war broke out, there was a total confusion, total disbelief, and fright among the community. And what really perpetuated this was the most disturbing incident for me is that certain marked Japanese men were immediately arrested by the local law enforcement and the FBI. These men were marked before the war started. And these men eventually were spread across the United States in various camps and some in prison. Now, these men were essentially maybe a vocal leaders of the community, or they belonged to a organization, a Japanese organization, or clubs, which the FBI and the law enforcement deemed as enemies of the United States. Okay. After these men were arrested, they were never to be seen again. A lot of them were never to be seen again till after the war. I met a woman whose father was in prison, of all places, I didn't realize this, Leavenworth. And he was housed behind a bar, behind the cells, in the bar. There was no rights for a trial, no constitutional rights, representation didn't exist. I hate to say this, but it parallels in Europe the Jews. What happened with the Jews in Europe. And the only ending was it was a different scenario. But anyway, my family resided in Oakland. My father, my mother, and my baby sister. And I remember we had a wood burning stove in the house.
Oh, wow.
And of course, my mother was in a panic. And I distinctly remember my mother burning anything that had to do with Japanese writings, books, dolls, toys, and burning them.
Oh, wow.
And what really disturbed me as a kid, as a little 4-year-old, was she threw my Japanese toys, especially a wooden samurai sword, and it really upset me, personally.
Yeah. Devastating.
Now, my mother's fright was understandable. Okay. Number one, my father entered the U.S. on a visitor's visa, but never returned back home. So essentially, he was illegal.
Right.
Number two, my father served in the Japanese Navy in the early 30s. That's a no-no.
Yes. You would have thought they would have come after him immediately.
My real name, last name is Taniguchi, not Yamamoto. He was supposedly adopted by the aunt, Mrs. Yamamoto, over here in the United States. Maybe because of this last name change, he was never arrested.
I see. Yeah, they couldn't track him. Him down. Yeah.
And I think my mother had the right to be panicked. Panicked. And to get back to the Japanese community, before the war, during the war, when the war broke out, we have to remember in the 40s, this country was not a mobile society,
Right.
essentially, as it exists today. And in those days, when you travel from Oakland to Sacramento, that was a big deal. You know,
Yes.
it was an
Yes.
undertaking.
Took a long
And
time.
many Japanese never looked beyond the community because there was, you know, so much comfort within that space.
Right.
I think there were about, when the war broke out, I think there was something like 10,000 travel passes that were issued, and less than half took advantage of it. And I know I have my travel pass that my mother saved for me.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we have it right here.
Oh, there it is. Yeah.
To show.
Yeah, that's it. And
Yeah.
yeah, luckily she saved it, you know. And I've also heard that many who attempted to leave California were turned back at the borders.
Right.
And so, again, going back to the Japanese community, let's say in California, where do you go?
Right.
You have a chance to leave California, but where do you go? Now, many, unless you had family members or friends that lived maybe in the Midwest, and outside of that, on your own, you really had no idea.
Right.
You know.
Right. And unless your family, like you, Howard, your dad had this connection with Mr. Wada, so
Yeah,
you
correct.
were able to do that. Howard, I want to stop you one second, but I have a question for you. First, for our panelists, our audience, I'm sorry if you hear some noise in the background. My neighbors are, I think, outside playing a game and they are laughing. It's a little loud. So I apologize to our audience if you hear that. So please forgive that. But that's what that noise is. So, but Howard, for you, you know, I want to ask you, since you were there and you were very young, but what are some of your vivid memories of Keetley? You know, what was it like to live there?
Okay, could I talk about the travel to Keetley?
Yes, yes.
Okay, that
please.
would, yeah. First of all, when we left for Keetley, that was near the around end of March. Okay, before the visitors pass was null and void. We traveled in our small car. Everything that we owned was stored in, you know, packed in the car. But I don't ever remember sleeping in motel or hotel.
Oh,
You know, on the trek from
yeah.
California, Nevada, and Utah. We slept in the back of the car. All the food we ate in the car. And the reason for this was my mother felt uncomfortable and scared to give us a room at a hotel and such, or eat in a restaurant, because she felt these eyes, so to speak, staring at her. And she felt extremely uncomfortable and scared. So this is why, generally, as far as the food was concerned, she bought in bulk.
To avoid going into a store. And,
Yeah, to avoid going to. It's understandable, you know, when you
Right.
feel uncomfortable. Now, when my father or my family found out about the move to Keetley, because my father was a skilled carpenter, he jumped at the chance. And plus, you know, his situation. But anyway, when we arrived in Keetley, it was an abandoned ghost town, as far as I was concerned. There was a large building. There was a building with 10 apartments, and scattered around the valley, Keetley Valley, were abandoned homes. I understand that it was a thriving community in its heydays. It was a mining community until the Depression turned Keetley into a ghost town, literally. And this is where we resided. Now, after Mr. Wada's initial plan was to farm this Keetley Valley. And he was when the snow melted away, he was shocked to find that the land was all rocks and stones. You know, it wasn't a farmland, but the men got together, cleared out the land, and made a pretty successful living, meager as it may be financially, farmed the land.
Right. Miraculously. I mean, that
miraculous is right. Yeah.
The ingenuity of how they did it.
Yeah, it was amazing. And there were some families that lived in Utah, that Japanese families that provided farm equipment to help us, you know.
Right.
But as far as the pictures that you showed, really brings back a lot of memories of Utah.
Do they?
I mean, of Keetley.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And to add some comfort to Keetley, my father and other men, they built a bathhouse.
Oh, wow.
Community bathhouse. It was big enough for, I don't know, 10 people. And those who are unfamiliar with a Japanese bathhouse, it was a huge metal wooden tub stoked by fire. And the bath was located in an enclosure where you washed yourself and you stepped in to soak and relax. Now, to me, a Japanese farm without a Japanese bath is not a farm. You know, it's it just went together. But anyway, also Mr. Wada, who was an avid fisherman, diverted a stream into the valley and made a pond and stocked with trout. And that was only used, he made a rule that only young kids were allowed to fish in there.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So that
children.
brought a lot of, you know, some comfort. I mean, some fun, you know, to the community.
You remember doing that too?
Pardon?
You remember doing that, fishing in the pond?
And you know, it was something, especially if you've never caught a fish before. It's such an excitement. And I also remember my mother gathering snow, put it in a cup, sprinkle it with Jell-O, and that was my dessert. But as far as on a personal note, you know, the first song that I learned while I was in Keetley was "Jesus Loves Me" as a kid, and that was because of the missionaries that came through Keetley.
Right.
They had Bible studies and such. And to me, I believe the tolerance of most people in Utah, or a lot of people in Utah, what they displayed was because most of them were Mormons. And the Mormons went through their persecution, you know, throughout their lives. So I like to think that this is why they had some compassion for the Japanese Americans there, you know, that came over. What the evacuation did do is help the Japanese Americans, those that were there, expand their world. Finally got out of the community and tried to expand, you know. I know my father later moved to Salt Lake City and opened up a Japanese restaurant. Although he was a carpenter, I guess somewhere along the line he learned how to cook and opened up a Japanese restaurant and such. So essentially, that's part of, you know, what I remember as,
Right.
yeah. And I
Yeah.
went through kindergarten and first grade in
Okay.
in Salt Lake.
In Salt Lake.
In Salt Lake, right.
Yeah. So you're Howard, thank you for sharing that. And you know, it's just invaluable to hear because you experienced that move and remember, you know, just living a different existence than a child that was perhaps living in camp at the time. And Howard, I want to, if you have more thoughts, hold on to them, but I want to bring Emiko in, and then Howard will bring you in a little bit later. But Emiko, we're going to you. You were your family was a very large family, I believe, right? Like, I mean, there was, yeah, it was a very large family in the Bay Area, the Endo family. And you yourself were not born yet until your family moved to Salt Lake City after Keetley, but you have much of the information and historical knowledge of what your parents went through. So I wanted to ask about, you know, the decision to move out to Keetley, which was, I believe, made by now Endo. So can you kind of describe that, and then why, you know, why did they make that choice to try to move your family out there?
Sure. First of all, Diana, thank you for you know, presenting this program on Keetley. I guess it's a story that many people have not heard of, and so I appreciate your focusing on this. And also, I have to preface my account by saying that I'm indebted to my cousin Tom Endo. He's the real family historian, and I'm just stepping in for him because
Yes.
so.
But he provided lots of information, so thank you, Tom.
Yeah, Tom. Everything's based on Tom's notes and his advice. Okay, the reason why we left Keetley, my grandmother. Of course, you know, it was a terrible time. There was a lot of fear, a lot of rumors, hysteria going around, and shortly after Pearl Harbor, my grandmother wanted to go to San Francisco to visit her mother. And so she had Uncle Frank, that's Tom's father, drive her to San Francisco. But before they reached the bridge, these MPs were there, and they stopped the car and had them throw everything out of the car. I mean, they just checked everything. I guess they were suspecting that my grandmother, who was 51 at the time, had some dangerous, you know, contraband aboard or something, you know. But anyway, it was a frightening experience. And so they went to San Francisco, had their visit. Well, on the way back, the same thing happened. The MPs did it all again, threw everything out of the car. And after that experience, she realized that, you know, it was, who knows what would have happened if they had stayed and gone to camp. She wasn't sure how the government would treat them, and she wanted to keep her large family together. She had 12 children, and the 6 older ones were married. My father was the oldest of the 12, and the 6 youngest ones are still, you know, 20, 22 and under, so they're all kind of underfoot yet. So anyway, she sent Uncle Frank, that's Tom's father, and my other uncle, Roy Tachiki, to Utah. They had a friend in Salt Lake City, Mr. Tsuyuki, and they were going to, you know, get his advice as to places where they might be able to settle the family. And so Mr. Tsuyuki was very generous. He let them use their 39 Buick and provided a driver, John Aoki, to drive them around to various places to look. And then by chance on March 6th, they bumped into Fred Wada at the US Cafe, which was their cafe. And after, you know, comparing notes and everything, they decided to join forces because of course, Mr. Wada wanted to settle his family too. And long story short, they went to Keetley to meet George Fisher, and then they drove to Roosevelt, and that's where they had the horrible reception there. The meeting hall probably was raucous, but then what was worse was when they went to have dinner, the people in the restaurant were just, started harassing them and all. And by that time, they had already reserved a hotel to stay. They were going to stay overnight in Roosevelt and then go back to Keetley. But they was so terrible. They didn't finish their dinners. They just left, and they didn't even get their money back from the hotel. They just drove back to Salt Lake City. So that pretty much showed them that Roosevelt was not a place to settle their families with all that anti-Japanese feeling.
Right. That's
that's when they decided, with Fred Wada, that let's settle our families. Let's check out Keetley again, and then they did a more thorough investigation. Of course, there was snow on the ground, and my uncle Roy Tachiki was actually a farmer, so he knew what farm country looked like. But of course, everything was under snow. So
right.
No,
they didn't see it. They couldn't see the actual land.
Didn't see it, and but anyway, they agreed on Keetley and signed all the paperwork and whatever, and came back, and then. By that time, public proclamation, they started doing some preparation. My Uncle Frank had a shokai, the Yamamoto shokai store where he sold a lot of Japanese foodstuffs. And then my mother's side of the family in Lompoc, my maternal grandfather, also had a general food store.
Okay.
And so, they started making preparations. And one of the things that was good about Keetley is that it had a train line. So they started putting, all their furniture, the beds and whatever and all the food stuff from both Oakland and Lompoc onto the trains. And they made those arrangements ahead of time. But then after a while, then Public Proclamation number 4 came out. And that was the one that said, by this time it was March 26th. And Public Proclamation 4 said that you had to be out by March 29th. So that was 3 days. So in the last 3 days, they really had to hustle and get everything in order. The group from Lompoc who joined us, they didn't even have their travel permits. They had to get them on the way in, and it was very nerve-wracking because they weren't sure.
Right. If that they could actually get approved or how they could do it, they were taking a chance.
That's right. And then, so on the evening of March 28th, the night before they had to be gone, my family had just bought a house in West Oakland. It was not a real large, but a fairly large house. And it had closed right before Pearl Harbor, thank goodness. So all the relatives and whoever was in our part of the caravan came to our house and slept on the floor wherever they could find space. They slept there. And from midnight, they started leaving the house in caravans of 4 to 5 cars each, at intervals, because they didn't want to leave all together because they didn't want to make the neighbors suspicious. So it was very stealthy, covert operation here. And they drove to Utah. It took three nights to get there. And but when I asked about how they were received, the first stop was at Truckee. And our relatives stayed in a motel that was owned by German people who were very sympathetic to them. So evidently our family didn't have too much trouble, but it was still scary because my mother at some point, she was pregnant with the brother right above me, the one who's in between my parents there in the picture. She was pregnant with him and she fainted. And my other aunt was also pregnant, and she just started screaming. She was just so upset. It was, very scary, right?
That's very scary. And you're on the road, and I'm sure, and I've heard from a lot of other people when they're traveling, medical care too, of people being willing to treat Japanese Americans or Japanese people along the way was also uncertain. That if something happened, I've heard some horror stories about that. The reaction to that. And Emiko, they did eventually settle there, or they went to Keetley and they arrived. But what your family was only there for a brief amount of time, correct?
Yes.
So they were only, and so what kind of led to that, and what were some of the challenges that they faced once they ended up there?
Well, I guess, it took them a while to get settled in their new life at Keetley, right? There was all this housing, who lived where, and all that. And there was still snow on the ground. So it took them a few weeks to get settled, I'm sure. And then once the snow melted, they had to move all the rocks and all that. And I'm told that they cleared about 150 acres of land, of the rocks and the boulders. And these women who had never done that kind of physical work in their lives, having to do all this heavy lifting work. But my cousin tells me that even though they cleared 150 acres of the Keetley, the George Fisher's land, it really wasn't that arable. And so they were able to rent 40 acres from the New Park Mining Company, which was down the hill and closer to the water source. They were able to get irrigation from the water source that was closer by. And it was that 40 acres that they actually ended up growing their first, and growing anything for the 4 years that they were there. And so after the first harvest, they only netted like $60 a family or $10 a person. And our family soon realized that, that amount of land was not enough to support 126 people. So
yes, right.
Our Endo family, we left and went to Sandy, and my family did sharecropping there with a farmer. And then, so our part of the family only was there for about 3 months. And
I see. Very brief.
Very brief. And then my mother's side of the family, the ones from Longpoke, they stayed till the end of the year, and then they went off on their own too. So actually, there are only about 60 of the Wada group still remaining there, and probably even less, at the end of the 4 years. But
so, and this photo, I like, because you shared this. This is after the move to Salt Lake, correct? And you were born. That's where you were born.
yes.
Yes. Oh, this is you and your mother.
When my family was in Sandy, after they got the crops kind of settled, one uncle tended the farm, and then Tom's father, Uncle Frank, and my father found jobs in Salt Lake City. And they rented a little room there, and they did shift work. So my father says that they would take turns sleeping on the bed because, when one was on day shift, the other was on swing shift or whatever. And then they'd go home to Sandy on the weekends. And then eventually they were able to move to Salt Lake City. They rented a home there. Of course, that's where I was born.
Yes.
So, when I look at all the old pictures, I see smiles, and I see kind of snippets of normal family life. So I guess it wasn't that bad after a while. I think as the Japanese got more accepted, and we weren't construed as a threat to
right.
the native Utahns. And so I love to see the pictures of our family's time in Utah. And, we're always with family. And I think that's where they got a lot of their strength, right?
Absolutely.
Our family was all there together.
Yes, and I love that, because I think you were mentioning before that the photos do show some sense of normalcy that they were trying to, you know, determine their own future, you know, all of those families. And so, but in the backdrop of all of this, there's, you know, all these people incarcerated all over the country. But even then, and it's not true freedom as well. These, all your family, the Wada family and Howard's and everyone else experienced, you know, a huge uprooting as well of their life and their livelihood and this difficulty. Though, you know, that there was success in it. And I want to actually just share, because some folks out there might want to know, you know, kind of the number of people. This is everybody who was in Keetley. So this is the list that was put together. So you can kind of see this and all the names. And I'm going to invite Emiko, thank you for that. And I'm going to invite Howard and Mary back in for a kind of brief sort of discussion with you about the, you know, how you feel your family fared in terms of avoiding camp. And Emiko, I'll start with you. Do you feel that their experience allowed them to be at a better place after the war than a family that had, you know, had actually gone through the incarceration? What do you, curious about your thoughts about that?
I don't know about that. I mean, my family was doing fairly well before the war, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the decision to go to Keetley allowed them to maintain their independence, and you know, and it avoided the uncertainty of what would happen to them if they were sent to camp. But I think that the opportunity to settle at Keetley gave them time to readjust their lives, so to speak, until they could move on and you know, get a little bit more under their feet.
Right.
You know, moving to Salt Lake City and all. So it tested their endurance and their stamina and their fortitude, right? For sure.
Yeah.
And they found out that they were a lot stronger than they thought they were beforehand.
Right, exactly. And Mary, for the same question for you and your, you know, how, I guess, your parents or your family, how they fared after in the wake of this. Do you feel this was overall positive for them, you know, in this experience of creating this colony outside of California?
Well, I think that my parents endured a lot, but they gained an awful lot too. As a family, all our relatives are extremely close. I've got cousins and aunties and uncles. Of course, most of them have passed away. But I think because of that experience together, it made us stronger. We felt more confident. People were able to feel the freedom to make their own decisions. And I think that really, because they made those decisions when they were in Keetley. I mean, it took an awful lot of courage for them to leave the safety of California and to go to an area that no one really knew what to expect. And once they settled there and they felt accepted, I think it just drew them closer together. So after the war, when they all returned back to California, they went on with their lives. And it was a closer union as our family grew closer together and did things together. So I think, basically, of course, it was a positive experience for us.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And Howard, you know, I have a separate question for you that's a little bit different. You know, if you, oh, and there he goes.
Oh, no.
That's okay. I'm sure he'll come back on. Oh, and apparently Evan, Howard's grandson, is watching. Thank you, Evan. If there is, I like asking this question of children of people, you know, who were Issei or Nisei or Kibei, because often, as we know, the experiences were not widely shared. You know, there was a lot of unknown from the parents to children. No one talked about it. What is something or a question that you would ask your parents today about their experience if you had the chance? And Mary, I'll start with you.
Well, I think, because we rarely talked about Keetley as a family, my parents were always so busy. I would thank them first, of course, for what they had endured and what they had done for the family, for us. And I would ask them basically, would they do it over again if they had the choice? Would they go through the Keatley experience, or would they have maybe just gone into the internment camp where they didn't have to be threatened by outsiders? I know my father would say absolutely they would go through Keatley again because he loved Keatley, and he called it heaven. He even wrote lyrics to a song that the ladies used to sing. That's how much he loved Keatley. So,
Oh my
it's what
goodness.
you make out of an experience, and he made something negative into positive, and so it was a very favorable time for him.
Oh, wow. And I also just want to say, for those who do any research after, or if anyone finds themselves at the Jordanelle Reservoir somewhere in the future, there is a sign that says Wada Way. There's a marker, and perhaps we can share somehow a little bit later on where that is. But there is a marker there. So, Emiko, same question for you. What would you ask your parents today if you had the chance about their experience?
Well, like Mary, I would also thank them for doing what they did, and it's a tremendous effort to make that move in such scary times. But I don't know. I guess, and I guess I wish I had more of a chance to ask them while they were alive. But I got from them that it was just a frightening time, right, and so much confusion. But I would be curious about being a mother, the logistics of such a move. I mean, they had little babies, toddlers, and I mean, the whole gamut of issues when you're dealing with young children along the way. And when they're there, that picture of the group at Keetley, the children's picture?
Yes.
Right.
Not all the kids. It didn't show all the toddlers and babies and infants that were there,
Well, there was one
Okay.
picture, right, where the parents were working out in the field, and there were some toddlers all in a little group. So they would watch their toddlers while they were working.
Yeah, so
Those
they weren't in that main other picture that
No, they were too young, right?
Yeah, so
Right.
there were a lot more kids, so I just would marvel, and I'd have questions about how they took care of everyone.
Oh,
I
absolutely.
know my father said that when they got to Keetley, he says, I just don't know how Mama and Fumie, my mother, cooked for all those people under those kind of conditions,
Right.
because
Yeah.
they were very rudimentary.
Yes. And the women, they were incredibly resourcul,
Very.
and just that monumental, you're right, all the logistics and details and keeping your baby, raising a child.
I wanted to add something to Howard when he talked about the furo. I remember my sister saying that when they were it was on the 29th of March, they were on their way to Keetley, and my father had a truck, I think, and a trailer. And then my father turns around and goes back to his now abandoned market, and he goes and gets this galvanized tub that they used for washing vegetables and fruit, and he piles it onto this truck, and that is what became the furo over in Keetley. But I know my sister used to say going over the Donner's Pass, the snow was deep and the truck would get stuck. And my father would say, go and get some rocks to put underneath the tires. But the snow was so deep, they couldn't find the rocks. And so fortunately, they were lucky that some highway patrol people came and got them out. But that's the story of the galvanized tub that turned into a furo, which your father made into a furo.
Those furos were very, very famous. I heard about those.
I know. Some of the girls would float up with the wood because they were so light. There would be about 10 girls in there, and the wood would just float up in the water because the girls weren't big enough to keep the wood down. So it was cute.
Mary, I wanted to just say that two of my uncles worked for your father.
Oh, is that right?
My uncles 5 and 6, Goro and Rokuro.
Oh, that's cute.
When they were,
Oh, Yeah.
I'd like to.
Howard.
Oh, I'm sorry. I blanked out. My computer
Okay.
blanked out for about a couple of minutes.
That's
I'm
fine.
back here.
No.
But before we close,
We talked about
I
you.
want to. I would like to. I know Mary is very modest about about Fred. To me personally, Fred Wada is my hero. I've never met up with anyone like him. With his 6th grade education,
Yeah.
he didn't have the eloquence, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
He was Sonomama. He was
Yeah.
himself.
But he built himself up to a point where he was a port commissioner in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
He was a member of the Olympic Committee, and he was instrumental in bringing the Olympics to, I think, 64 Olympics, Mary?
That's right. You're right.
Yeah, 64 Olympics. And I thought I heard he was also instrumental in getting the Olympics to Mexico.
Yes, it's
Yeah.
a long story, but it's true. Because he got to know the Mexican Olympic Committee people, but that's another story.
I mean, what he's accomplished in his life. I mean,
Yeah.
who can do that? And who can
Mhm.
say that? It's amazing.
Well, he loved Japan. He really loved Japan and wanted to, bring up the Japanese economy, and after the war especially. And so he did anything to bring businesses into the States and bringing athletes into the States. And it just meant a lot to him, I think, that he felt proud of the Japanese, and he wanted to bring their abilities into fruition here in the States. So he worked hard for them.
Yes. I have there is an audience question. There's a couple. One, I think we can definitely answer. Howard, this might be your son, Ryan. Ryan.
Pardon?
I believe it's your son, I think. He's asking, how did Mr. Wada choose which families to bring with him? Aside from, I guess, Emiko, your family, the Endo family, because that was kind of a collaboration. But Mary or Howard, or do you know, what did your dad look for in terms of bringing people with them, to go and reside in Keetley?
That's an interesting question. I really don't know, but our family was a big family, and the families had families.
Mhm.
And so I don't think he said no to anybody who wanted to, escape incarceration. He welcomed and, take him with him. But I really don't know that answer.
I see.
But
Yeah.
127 people, was a big group. And I think the real reason why he picked Keetley was because there were buildings there and there was a place for them to seek shelter. And that was the most important thing, because where do you take 127 people?
Exactly.
And I think I've heard accounts where of this group, Keetley group, that said that certain people were chosen for their specific skills, like the carpenters and the farmers. But I don't think that was the case. Do you, Mary? I think that we have this expertise within the families and the friends that we.
Yeah, no, I don't think you could do that, actually, because doctors and dentists didn't want to maybe leave, or I think it was just through family.
Yeah.
Family and friends.
I'm glad to know definitively that was kind of the case, because if someone from the outside heard it, they would think, oh, they were specifically chosen, but it was just whoever could manage to leave tried to leave. I want to.
What was so interesting also was that the governor had asked my father to try to get people in the internment camps to come to Utah. And so he sent a group of people from Keetley to the different, like Topaz and Manzanar, to different camps, trying to encourage them to come into Keetley. But I don't think they were very successful then.
Oh, wow.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
They needed the farm labor, huh?
They needed the farm labor,
Needed the farm
exactly,
labor.
right. And then actually my father was put in jail, I think in Texas, for overnight because the FBI or someone had picked them up, didn't know what they were doing out there in no man's land. And so they were in jail. I think there were about 7 or 10 people who were traveling together trying to encourage the people to come out of the internment camps. But they were in jail one night, and they went as far as New Orleans, I think.
Wow.
Oh my
So
gosh.
anyway, so I was told.
That was an interesting story on the farm labor program that was earlier today.
Mhm.
They were trying to recruit people from the camps to go to the farms because they were short of labor, and
Right.
that was one of the strategies that Governor Ma
Well,
and George Fisher used to argue for this Keetley group to come to Utah, because they said we're solving the evacuation problem and we're gonna provide labor for growing food. So they tried to put that twist on it politically to bring favor to our group going to Utah. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff going on.
right, a lot of political movements.
Well, and that's something I just thought. I didn't know that there was a kind of recruitment happening through the camps. Just the immense amount of decisions that had to be made, which actually is something I want to, I think, wrap up and end on with the three of you. And starting with Howard, I guess would be good, is I want to know, this is kind of an impossible hypothetical question, but put in the same situation as your parents, and in light of, or in the wake of 9066, would you have done the same thing? Would you have made the same decision that your parents made?
I think I would have, but of course, not knowing what lies ahead, that would be a question that, well, it can't be answered until it happens. But I think if there's a way of getting away from a negative situation, yes, I think I would have, personally.
Okay. Emiko, how about you? What do you
I
think?
feel the same. If I were my grandmother, I don't know if I'd have the courage to have made the decision. But if I was following my grandmother, I mean, I would happily go with her just to be with the family. And thank goodness, times are different now. We don't have to make those questions or decisions about survival,
True.
like they did. I mean, that was really courageous of them, but I don't know if I would be brave myself to make that decision today. But with my grandmother and my family, yes.
Right. And Mary, what about you?
I think I feel the same. I think if there was a threatening situation, we would make an effort to leave. As to where, that's a different question. I know at that time, Colorado had a Japanese community, and they were accepting the Japanese in Colorado in the 40s. But, we thought we should go to Canada or somewhere. I don't know. But I don't think I'd have the courage to be responsible for as many people who had, that had gone to Keetley. I would just probably go with my own family.
Right.
Making decisions for myself, but to make a decision for a big group of people, I don't know if I had the courage.
But your dad was phenomenal. He was phenomenal.
He believed, he would just seize an opportunity and just make it his own. If he believed in something, he just went all the way. That was his personality. Not always hard to live with somebody like that, but that was his strength. Yeah.
Mary, did you relate the story that or your experience when you went back to Japan a couple of years ago?
Oh no, there was a special celebration for my father in Gobo, Wakayama, where he's from. But that was mainly more for his involvement in the Olympics. And that was like in 2018, they invited my husband and myself to go to Gobo, and they had an elaborate ceremony for my father, in memory of my father. It was just incredible, and we were so touched with what they did. They have
Well,
a little museum.
how about the city bus?
Oh yeah, yeah. When we got into the town of Gobo, they had a city bus greet us, and it had a huge picture of my father's face. And then when we got into the town of Gobo, on the wall by the train, right in the train station, there's this enormous picture of my father smiling. So that was a surprise, a wonderful surprise to see that.
They're all proud of their hometown boy.
That's
Yes.
right. Yeah,
His
that's
legacy.
right. Hometown boy.
His
Yes.
legacy lives on. And on that note too, I just want to say that to all three of you who I hope not too begrudgingly, but I know that I had to kind of convince you to speak about your experience, but I'm just so grateful that each of you did share what you shared, because it's, truly the legacy of your parents and their strength and courage, and just, and your commitment to telling their story. And so I think I want to wrap now, but thank each of you deeply for being here and sharing this experience, and adding another dimension to the story of our community, what happened during the war, because there are just so many incredible unknown stories. And so I hope our audience got to learn something new, and had something interesting to kind of hear today. So definitely appreciate all of you.
Thank you, Diana, for holding this for us. It's been helpful to me too, to learn about my family. Thank you.
Yes, thank you all. Thank you. And
it's so nice that the younger generation makes these opportunities available, to spread the history of that time.
That's right. You're right.
Yeah.
Let's face it, without the younger generations and such, I think it would have been lost. Who came out with all this, and people like Diane,
Yeah, that's true.
it would have easily been lost.
That's true.
Easily been lost.
You're right, Howard.
There's not enough written in the history books about this period, and I think the younger generation, they need to know the story, but I think they get more from these interpersonal tellings of the story, right? I mean, if I hear someone, I remember it more than just reading it in a book. And so thank you for the opportunity to bring our personal stories.
Oh,
my hat's off to you.
Oh my goodness. No, this is
really, thank you.
Or my headphone off to you. Yeah.
Your headphone off, which I'm glad worked today. But no, it is our honor to share your story, and to just learn and continue to be inspired by you. And I also just want to thank Kimiko Mar of Tadaima and Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimages for coordinating this. And thank you to our audience for listening today. And thank you again to the three of you. Everyone have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you. You
Thank
too.
you.